Hello and welcome to this episode of Piano Pandemictivities, Things I Wish I'd Known. Let's follow up a little bit on this question of improvisation as more important than memorization. And I'd like to explain a little bit more what I was thinking about and what led me to make that statement. I have made a pie chart, indeed a couple of pie charts if you can imagine. So I will overlay that across my face right now. And what you see is kind of off the top of my head how my time was spent in music school on different topics. And the majority of the chart in blue was working on preparing memorized repertoire. And I'm thinking of both my undergrad and grad school. And then the orange part would be technique, and that would include both, like basic things like scales and arpeggios, but also etudes and working through, difficult things that were actually part of the memorized repertoire. So in a way, the orange and the blue sort of go together as being two aspects of the same thing. In fact, I would say, in my case, most of the technical stuff I was doing was for the sake of difficult passages in memorized repertoire. For example, I did probably 12 Chopin etudes, and or I may have had a difficult time with a Scriabin sonata and wanted to talk about it, but it was coming out of the project of working on memorized repertoire. So if you put those together, that's the vast majority of one's time in lessons and at the piano. And then the other two things I put in here, the gray is collaboration, and by that, of course, I mean accompanying and chamber music and that kind of stuff. Now, I did participate in a really good art song seminar in grad school where we would meet every week, and we went through, we had to prepare a song every week with a singer and a pianist, and we went through kind of everything from Schubert to, I don't know, Hugo Wolf or something over the course of 3 semesters. It was great. It was really great because it was performing, but that was not required. So here on this chart, I'm thinking of what was required for everyone, and it was only a very small amount, only a few credits that you had to do. And then the yellow is sight reading, and I did have a required course. I think it was required as an undergrad that was specifically dedicated to sight reading, not just accompanying, but actually specifically sight reading. So there, when you put all that together, particularly the orange and the blue, overwhelmingly most of the hours of every day were given over to this idea of memorized repertoire and the technical requirements of playing the memorized repertoire. And what has led me to say some of the things I've said is, having taught for a number of years now, I look at the amount of time that goes into playing memorized repertoire, let's say working up toward a senior recital, maybe playing other recitals along the way, playing concerto competition, this and that. The amount of time, the percentage of time dedicated to just doing this memorized repertoire in order to get through the degree, compared with what one actually does as a professional, seems disproportionate to me. It seems like we pay a very, very high price to do all this memorized repertoire. And so I've actually backed away from it. When I first started teaching, all the juries were from memory, everything on recitals was from memory. And I've really backed away from that because I've wanted to teach other things that I think young professionals need. Now, we're very fortunate at my school. We have a really good keyboard pedagogy program, so we have those credits set aside so that they can talk about learning styles and look at all the different methods and talk about the different philosophies of middle C position and starting on the black keys, and even learning about taxes and insurance and all that stuff about running their studio. So thank heavens we have that, and we're not trying to get that done in the teaching studio as well. But for those schools that are not doing that, That's another thing they're going to need when they get out there, because they are going to teach. They're absolutely going to teach to put a hamburger on their plate. They're not going to play Chopin etudes to make a living. I would venture to say, these videos, they get 1,000 views or 2,000 views or whatever. I would venture to say that of let's say 1,000 people watch this, I would venture to say that less than 1% have ever played a Chopin etude and gotten paid for it of those who are watching. It's just a very, very small percentage. And so we have to be thinking about structuring our teaching systems to what is going to be for the common good. Yes, a few of us do go out and play memorized repertoire and get a little paycheck for it from time to time, but for most people that's not the case. So I made this other graph. I'm so proud. I looked up how to make a pie chart in Word, and I did it. So anyway, here's my second pie chart. And this, I included 5 things, to some extent off the top of my head, of how I would divide up the time if I had absolute freedom to do everything I want. And I'll explain why I don't have freedom in a minute. But what we have here is the dark blue is repertoire, and I put memorized in a question mark because sometimes it's practical and appropriate and beneficial to memorize, and sometimes it's not. And so memorization is kind of on a case-by-case basis. And that's actually what I do now. If I have a student auditioning for a graduate program, for example, I will absolutely have that student memorize some big, difficult repertoire because that's going to be expected when they move on to that other world. If I have, let's say, a keyboard pedagogy major or a Bachelor of Arts student doing a senior recital, and they have a lot of different projects going on, a lot of different interests, and they are playing, say, a Mozart sonata, I see no reason why they shouldn't play that from the score, as long as they can do it well, and then have the other time they would have spent on memorization to give to other things. Okay, so memorized repertoire, maybe. Then I put in, these are all 20%, so it's divided into fifths. I put in improvisation. And by improvisation, what I really mean is kind of a return to the broad musicianship of the 18th century, where one is improvising and composing little pieces, doing partimento and figured bass, kind of all in one seamless set of activities, and by which one learns to fake and to make up little pieces, and one also learns how music works, how to compose, how to arrange. You get all of this when you're working in improvisation and partimento. So I would make that a significant part of study. Then, of course, technique. And one of the things I see as really important in technique and missing in a lot of people in technique is they've figured out how to play the piano more or less by trial and error, and sometimes the errors stick with them. And they can't describe what they're doing. They don't have names for the different motions. They don't really distinguish between motions that are ergonomically advantageous and those that are kind of ridiculous or even injurious. They just kind of use whatever habits have formed. And often, the majority of the time, these students need to have the mechanics of piano playing explained to them. To avoid isolation, to avoid lateral stretching, to avoid repetitive stress injury. So that actually is a huge pain, and it takes a lot of time, and it's an important part of doing this. So I give that a piece of the pie. All right, sight reading. I would put more emphasis on sight reading because it's going to be an important skill later, both in teaching, where you're demonstrating stuff for students, accompanying one's students, and of course working as a collaborative pianist, playing for singers and instrumentalists, playing for the high school talent show where you get paid for that. Any kind of religious service music, all of that is lucrative, good employment. And then finally, I put a part in there and 20% in there for collaboration, accompanying, playing chamber music, sonatas, and art song and stuff like that. So this is more what I would love to see if I could just do anything I wanted. More of a balance between these activities. Some of the limitations that I run into, one is students who are bound for graduate school. I have to get them ready to meet the standards of the kind of typical piano requirements. So, a Baroque piece memorized and a classical sonata memorized and a big romantic piece memorized, I have to get them ready to do that. So I actually have to spend a lot of time on memorization and all of that kind of stuff, and on a repertoire. The other is if I take in a student who's musically very talented, very intelligent, but has some kind of technical deficiency or previous injury. Now that's going to take a long time. I've worked with some students with different types of disabilities. It's very rewarding. I'm very proud of what I did with them, but it takes up all the time. And so it's not always possible to do this. Another thing that comes up is what I call narratives of failure. And this comes from students who have been put up to perform, usually through high school. They were told they had to memorize, but they weren't given the tools to memorize. And so they just repeated and repeated and repeated a piece until they thought they knew it. And they were pushed out on stage, and they had a memory failure, and they were humiliated in front of everybody. And that happened once. And so the next time they tried to do it, they were even more scared. And that helped it happen again. And then maybe it happened a couple more times. And by that time, they have established in their own mind a narrative of failure. And it goes like this. I try my hardest. I try my best. I work like crazy. But there's this kind of weird curse. There's this like Charlie Brown cloud, dark cloud over me. So when I go out on stage, I am going to crash and burn because this is who I am. Okay? So by the time I meet them, they hate performing because they have this, what I call narrative of failure. If you get a student like that, you now have to invest time replacing that narrative of failure with a narrative of success. I'm going to link to an article I wrote on this down in the thing, down below. I believe it was in Piano Pedagogy Forum, and you can read further on that whole issue. So this is where this idea is coming from, that improvisation should have a greater role. You'll notice, if I go back to the previous graph, there it is. You'll notice that the proportions are uneven, and the vast proportion is given to memorized repertoire and technique. And the thing that's missing is there's no discussion of improvisation at all. Now, I'm suggesting that improvisation could be equal in importance to memorized repertoire, or repertoire played from the score. And I would probably argue it's actually even more important. But I'm at least saying let's see what it would look like if it were equal. In the current system, the system I was raised in and the system you were likely raised in, it had no role whatsoever. Okay? Which I just find to be a little bit of a tragedy. I'll tell you one story. Now, I dearly love my teachers, both of whom have passed on now. My grad school teachers, Ann Koscielny and Raymond Hansen. But to give you an idea of the musical world they came from, I was visiting them at their home in Massachusetts after they retired. And I was talking with Mr. Hansen about his life and interviewing him for an article. And I mentioned to him, I've gotten very interested in improvisation. And he said, improvisation. That's nice. He said, I knew some people who liked to do a little bit of that. He said, but me, I've always preferred legitimate music. That was the phrase he used, legitimate music. And I had to say it stung just a little bit. But I understood, because the world he came from had exalted the standard repertoire to this like scriptural level. The notes of Beethoven are holy, and they are to be obeyed without question. And who are you, you unworthy low person, to add your own notes? We don't want to hear from you. We only want to hear from Beethoven. So that was his world. I think that's too bad, and I think we're past time for a little bit of change. So I wish I had known that improvisation was out there and that I could have started working on it at a much younger age, that I didn't have to spend all of my time on getting ready for memorized repertoire. Although in my life it's still a big part. In most of my students' lives, it's not. And I think we have to come to terms with that. So those are some things I wish I had known. We'll see you next time. Ciao.